The babysitter arrived in the early evening, cheerful and full of energy. My partner and I felt relieved. We had found someone reliable, or so we thought. To be safe, we decided to set up a hidden nanny cam in the corner of the living room, aimed directly at the play area. We wanted to ensure our child was in good hands. That night we settled on the couch, anticipation buzzing between us. The screen flickered to life, revealing our son laughing and playing with the babysitter. They built towers of blocks and she sang cheerful songs. It all seemed so normal, so perfect. We smiled, but there was an undercurrent of worry. We could never be too careful. As the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. Our child yawned and snuggled into his blanket. The babysitter, once lively, suddenly sat up, her body rigid. We exchanged glances, and curiosity mixed with discomfort. She turned her head towards the camera, and for 5 whole minutes she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was eerie, wide and empty. Her eyes, devoid of warmth, seemed to pierce right through the lens. We felt a chill sweep through the room, but we couldn't look away. When the recording ended, we turned to each other, both shaken. What had we just seen? We barely slept that night, images of her unsettling smile replaying in our minds. Morning light brought no relief. We gathered our courage and confronted the babysitter. She arrived, bright and cheerful as if nothing was amiss. When we asked her about the night, she seemed puzzled. "I don't remember anything past 11 p.m., she said, her smile unwavering. Our hearts raced. We shared a glance filled with confusion and fear. We pressed her for details, but she only shrugged, insisting she had no recollection of the strange event. We felt trapped in an unsettling cycle of uncertainty. We reviewed the footage again, but the camera showed only innocent play and sweet bedtime rituals until that moment at midnight. No signs of distress, no hint of something lurking beneath the surface. It was just her smiling, staring right at us. The whole day passed in a haze. Our child was oblivious, blissfully unaware of the dark turn the evening had taken. As evening approached, the babysitter returned, offering her usual friendly greetings. Our hearts raced again. What if she did remember? What if this was all part of something we could not comprehend? We knew we needed to protect our child, but could we really trust her? In a moment of madness, we decided to hide the camera. We wanted to see how she would act without the watchful eye. But as she took our son in her arms, her expression shifted. A flicker of something sinister crossed her face. The night dragged on, a twisted blend of anxiety and dread. I could not shake the feeling of being drawn into a game we didn't understand. The clock crept closer to midnight again. We waited, hoping for some normalcy, yet expecting the worst. When the clock struck 12, the air thickened with tension. Our hearts raced. We knew we were playing with fire. The babysitter looked towards the darkness and a smile crept onto her face. We held our breath, praying for dawn to break. Every morning I stepped outside to find my car unlocked. I always locked it, yet there it sat, inviting and vulnerable. The first time I brushed it off as forgetfulness. Perhaps I'd been too tired, lost in my thoughts, but as the days turned into weeks, the pattern became clear. Each dawn the doors stood open like an eerie welcome mat. Curiosity morphed into dread. I decided to check the security footage. I positioned the camera to capture my car, ensuring it had a clear view of the driveway. I needed proof, a reason or a rational explanation. I wanted to see if my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning I watched the footage. There I was, in the dim glow of the streetlight, getting out of my car. I pressed the lock button and walked away. I looked fine, no signs of distress or distraction, just me going about my routine. I sat up, heart racing. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I became increasingly anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. The hours crept by, and at exactly 3:12 a.m., the footage revealed a chilling reality. The car's locks clicked open, the passenger side door swung wide, and an unseen presence emerged. Just before I could see who, the screen flickered and went static. Panic clawed at my insides. I replayed the clip, hoping for clarity. Each time, it ended the same. A ghostly silence filled the void where the footage cut off. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think. My life became a cycle of fear and confusion. The next night I braced myself. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, and recorded the scene again. As the clock inched toward 3:12, dread tightened its grip. I didn't dare take my eyes off the screen. The hour struck, and once again the locks clicked. The passenger door creaked open. My breath caught as I waited for the figure to step into view, but the screen went static once more. Frustration mixed with terror. Determined, I went outside, clutching a flashlight. I approached the car, scanning every shadow. The night was quiet, save for my heart pounding. The air felt electric, thick with a sense of impending doom. I looked at the open door, feeling its invitation. After what felt like hours, I finally stepped back, breathless. I locked the car and returned to my house, but sleep would not come. The next morning, the car sat unlocked again, mocking me. Days passed in this twisted cycle. I could not escape it. The security footage revealed nothing new, only the same harrowing scene replaying in my mind. I lost track of time and reality. The world outside faded, reduced to a dull hum. Finally, I resolved to face whatever lurked within that car. I positioned myself in the driveway, ready. I waited, alone in the chilling dark, with only the moon for company. As the hour approached, the tension tightened. I could feel the air crackling, waiting for the moment. At 3:12 a.m., the locks clicked once more and the door opened, swinging silently. I stared into the darkness of the car. Nothing emerged. No figure, no sound. The static had not returned, but something felt wrong. An emptiness spread around me. I stepped closer, my heart beat a frantic echo in the stillness. Then, as if sensing my presence, the door swung shut. The sound echoed in the night, filling me with a chilling sense of dread. Alone in the darkness, I understood that I was not just observing the horror. I was part of it now. The finality of the situation washed over me as I turned, my breath catching. I stumbled back only to find the door to my home closed, as if locking me out of safety. The night sounds carried through the thin walls of the house. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening. A faint sound drifted from the baby monitor on the bedside table. A whisper, almost lost in the silence of the late hour. I sat up, reaching for the small device. Static crackled from the speaker, a common sound. I lowered the volume, thinking it was just interference, but then beneath the static I perceived something else, a murmur, indistinct but undeniably present. I pressed my ear to the monitor. The static buzzed in my ear, and then a thread of something recognizable within it. The cadence of speech, but scrambled, broken up by the noise. I adjusted the aerial on the monitor, hoping for a clearer signal. The static lessened, and the murmur solidified into a semblance of a voice I knew. It couldn't be. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. It sounded like her, my wife, gone these past months. Impossible. I told myself it was tiredness, grief playing tricks on my ears. I switched the monitor off, plunging the room into deeper silence. The quiet was immediate, absolute, too absolute. I switched it back on. The static returned, and so did the voice. Fainter now, buried deeper in the buzz, but still there, saying something. I strained to decipher the words, piecing together fragments from the distorted sounds. It was her tone, the lilt of her speech, undeniably hers. But the words were different. She was talking about our son, our baby asleep in the next room. The words were not loving, not gentle as a mother's should be. They were sharp, edged with something cold. I raised the volume cautiously, fear knotting in my stomach. The voice grew slightly louder, more present in the room. The static seemed to pulse with it. It was talking about him in possessive terms, like he wasn't just our child, like he belonged entirely to her. The words were fragments, broken by static, but the meaning was taking shape, a dark and unsettling form. A chill spread through me despite the warmth of the duvet. Each night after that it was there. The monitor, switched on to check on my son, became a conduit for that voice. It always started quietly, masked by static, then grew clearer as the night deepened. The content of the voice became more distinct, more disturbing. It moved beyond mere possession. It was filled with warnings about him, about our son. The warnings shifted into threats, veiled at first, then increasingly direct. Threats aimed at the baby. I would sit up in bed rigid, listening to the chilling murmur emanating from the plastic box. Each word, even fragmented by static, pierced through the silence of the room, planting seeds of dread in my mind. I started checking on him constantly, creeping into his nursery multiple times a night. He was always asleep, peaceful in his cot, but the voice in the monitor painted a different picture. A picture of something creeping, something approaching, something connected to her voice. Sleep became a luxury. I was constantly on edge, listening for the shift in the static, for the emergence of that voice. The nursery monitor became an object of dread and morbid fascination. I couldn't switch it off completely. I needed to hear it, needed to know what it was saying, even as it terrified me. One night the voice shifted again. It was no longer just warnings or threats. It was confessions, whispers of things she had never told me when she was alive. Things hidden, secrets kept. These secrets were not of everyday life. They were darker. They were about him, about our son's lineage, about things that predated us both. The confessions spoke of a pact, a promise made long before we met, a promise connected to our family line, a promise that involved sacrifice. The word itself was a punch to the gut. Sacrifice, involving our baby. My blood ran cold. I gripped the monitor, knuckles white. The voice became almost conversational, despite the static still crackling around it. It was like she was in the room, whispering to me, sharing these horrifying secrets. Secrets that explained nothing, yet insinuated everything terrible. Secrets that pointed towards our innocent child being in danger. The confessions became more frantic, laced with an undercurrent of desperation. It was as if she was trapped, trying to communicate something vital, something urgent. The desperation was contagious. It seeped into me, tightening the knot of fear in my stomach until it was almost unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. The voice, the threats, the confessions, the constant dread. I had to see something. Rational thought screamed at me that it was impossible, that it was grief, that it was stress, that it was anything but her voice coming from a baby monitor. But a primal instinct insisted otherwise. I turned on the nursery camera. The small screen flickered to life, displaying the view of the cot. My son was asleep, just as he always was, peaceful, oblivious. Relief washed over me, weak but present. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just noise. Then, on the edge of the screen, in the corner of the room, I noticed something. A darkness, not just the normal shadows of a dimly lit room. This was different, formless initially. But as I stared, willing it to be just a trick of the light, it began to coalesce. It took shape slowly, emerging from the deeper shadows in the corner. It was tall, vaguely humanoid, darker than the surrounding darkness, and it was positioned directly over the cot. Its form was indistinct, blurred, but its presence was undeniable. Leaning over my sleeping child, I stared, frozen, at the screen. The static from the monitor filled the room, punctuated by the faint, distorted whisper of her voice. And on the screen, the dark figure remained, unmoving, looming over the cot. My child slept on, unaware, but I was awake, and I was watching. The drive to the countryside felt longer than last week. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, grey under the overcast sky. The nursing home appeared at the end of a lane, a large old house trying to look cheerful with bright paint around the windows. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something faintly sweet. Mum sat in her usual chair by the window, looking smaller than ever. Her smile seemed a bit weak, but she knew me. I sat beside her, taking her hand. It felt frail in mine. That's when I noticed them. On her arms, just above her wrists, were marks. Dark purple blooming against her pale skin like bruises. I touched one gently. Mum didn't flinch, but her eyes didn't meet mine properly. They seemed to drift away, unfocused. I looked around for a nurse. A young woman, all smiles and efficiency, came over. I pointed to Mum's arms, a question in my eyes. She followed my gaze and her smile tightened a fraction. "Oh, those," she said, her voice bright. "Just a little clumsy, dear. Sometimes she bumps into things." Clumsy? These weren't little bumps, these were proper bruises. I looked at Mum again. She was staring out of the window now, not seeing anything in particular. The young nurse patted my arm. "Don't you worry, we look after her very well." She moved off to another resident, her cheerfulness a little too loud. I stayed with Mum for another hour. I tried to ask her about the bruises, but she just looked confused and patted my hand back. Her words were mumbled, not making much sense. Leaving felt wrong. Something about the nurse's too quick explanation, Mum's vacant eyes, the lingering sweet smell in the air. It all sat badly with me. Driving home, the grey fields seemed darker. The image of those bruises stayed with me, sharp and ugly. Clumsy. It just didn't fit. Mum had always been careful, precise, and these bruises, they looked like they were from fingers gripping too tightly. Sleep was difficult that night. I kept seeing Mum's arms, those dark marks. The bright smile of the nurse felt false now, rehearsed. The sweet smell in the air seemed less sweet, more sickly. A knot of worry twisted in my stomach. By morning I had made a decision. I had to know for sure. I couldn't just accept clumsy and walk away. The thought of Mum, vulnerable and alone in that place, filled me with cold dread. Evening came. Darkness settled over the countryside. I parked my car further down the lane from the nursing home, hidden behind a clump of trees. The building was quiet now, most of the lights off. Only a few windows glowed dimly on the ground floor. I walked through the garden, keeping to the edges, moving quietly on the grass. The back door, usually locked after visiting hours, was slightly ajar. A wave of nervousness went through me, but I pushed it down. This felt necessary. Inside, the corridor was dimly lit by small lamps on the walls. The air was still and silent. The sweet smell was stronger here, almost cloying. I moved down the corridor, past closed doors. Each room was silent, still. The residents asleep, or so I hoped. I reached the nurses' station. It was empty. A desk lamp cast a pool of light on a notepad and some files. Behind the station, a door led to what I guessed was the medication room. It was unlocked. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles and boxes. The sweet smell was strongest here, almost overpowering. I scanned the shelves, my eyes searching. Nothing immediately jumped out as alarming, just medicine, as expected. Then I noticed a small cabinet tucked away in a corner. It was slightly open. I pulled it wider. Inside, rows of vials shimmered in the dim light. They weren't labeled like the other medications. These had only numbers on them, and syringes, lots of syringes. My heart began to beat faster. This didn't feel right, not at all. These looked hidden, unregulated. I picked up a vial, turning it in my fingers. The liquid inside was clear. What was it? Why were they hidden away? Just then, a sound from the corridor made me freeze, footsteps coming closer. Quickly, I put the vial back, closed the cabinet as quietly as I could, and slipped out of the medication room back into the shadows of the corridor. The footsteps approached. It was the young nurse from earlier. She was carrying a tray with a jug and glasses. She didn't see me, not in the dim light. She went into one of the rooms further down the corridor. I waited, my breath held. A moment later she came out, empty tray in hand. She walked back towards the nurse's station, then hesitated. She glanced towards the medication room. Had she heard something? Sensed something? She came towards the medication room door. My pulse raced. I had to move. Quickly, I ducked into the nearest room just before she reached the medication room. The room was dark, silent. I stood behind the door listening. I could hear her moving around in the medication room. Then she came out again, locking the door behind her. She walked back to the nurse's station, then out of sight, presumably into another part of the building. I waited a moment longer, then cautiously opened the door of the room I was in. It was Mum's room. She was in bed, asleep. Or was she asleep? Her breathing was shallow, almost silent. Her face was pale, too pale. I went to her bedside, bending close. Her eyes were closed, but something was different. Something in her stillness felt wrong. I touched her hand. It was cold. Colder than it should be. A wave of icy fear washed over me. I gently lifted her eyelid. Her eye was fixed, staring blankly upwards. No life in it, no recognition, just nothing. "Mum!" My mind screamed, but no sound came out. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was seeing. She was gone, but how? She had been all right this afternoon. A little frail, yes, but not this. My gaze fell to her arm again, the bruises. And then I remembered the hidden vials, the syringes, the sweet, sickly smell. It all slammed into place, a horrifying realization. I had to get out. I had to call someone, tell someone what was happening here. I backed away from Mum's bed, my legs feeling like lead. I turned to leave the room, and then she was there, the young nurse, standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. Her bright smile was gone. Her face was hard, cold. In her hand she held a syringe, one of the syringes from the hidden cabinet. Before I could react, she moved, too fast. A sharp prick in my arm, a burning sensation, my vision blurred. My legs buckled. I tried to speak, to shout, but no sound would come. Darkness closed in. I sank to the floor, the sweet smell filling my nostrils, sickeningly sweet now, mixed with something metallic, something like blood. The last thing before everything went black, was the nurse's face above me, her eyes empty, devoid of any warmth, any humanity, then nothing. I woke up, slowly, groggily, my head throbbed, my body felt numb, heavy. Where was I? This wasn't Mum's room. This wasn't even the nursing home. I was lying in a bed, a narrow bed with white sheets. The air smelled different here, clean, sterile, like a hospital. But why? How did I get here? I tried to move to sit up, but my arms were held down. Straps around my wrists, holding me to the bed. Panic started to rise in my chest. Why was I strapped down? I forced my head to turn. Around the room, other beds, identical to mine, and in each bed, someone lying still, covered with white sheets, like me. But they weren't moving, not a flicker, not a breath, just still forms under white sheets. Too still, unnaturally still. I stared at the nearest bed. A hand lay outside the sheet, pale, lifeless, the skin tinged with blue, like Mum's hand when I touched it in her room. My blood ran cold. I looked around the room again, properly this time, at each bed, at each still form. And then I recognized some of them. Mrs. Davis, from the lounge downstairs. Mr. Peterson, who always smiled at me. Old Mr. Henderson, with his funny stories. They were all here, all of them, lying in beds, so still, so silent, like they were... No, it couldn't be. It just couldn't be. But the cold hands, the blue tinge, the unnatural stillness, it all pointed to one unthinkable, horrifying conclusion. And then from the corner of my eye, something caught my attention. A small tag attached to the end of each bed, a white tag with black writing on it. I strained to see, my heart pounding in my ears. The writing was small, but I could just make it out. On each tag, the same word repeated again and again under each still form. Just one word in simple black letters, disposed. We walked onto the path. Locals in the village gave us strange looks, shaking their heads. They tried to tell us something. We did not listen. We were keen walkers, always looking for somewhere new. This path on the map looked interesting, going deep into the woods. The trees were tall and close together. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. It was quiet, much quieter than woods near home. No birds sang, no wind moved the leaves high above. It felt still, too still maybe. We walked further in. The path narrowed, roots crossed it like tangled ropes. We had to watch our feet. The trees grew darker, their branches twisted shapes against the fading sky. It was late afternoon. We needed to find a place to camp soon. We planned to camp deep in the woods to be away from everything. Then we saw them. Tents, not ours. Small tents, dotted among the trees just off the path. Odd. They looked old, weathered. We went to look closer. They were zipped shut. No one seemed to be about. We called out. No answer, just the quiet woods all around us. It felt stranger now, seeing these tents and no people. We unzipped one tent. We peered inside. Sleeping bags lay spread out inside. Rucksacks stood packed in the corner. Everything looked like people just left it there. Left in a hurry, maybe, or just gone for a walk. But where were they? It was getting late to be out walking in these woods. We checked another tent. Same thing, belongings inside, clothes, books, water bottles, everything you need for camping, but no people. It began to feel wrong. Very wrong. Why would anyone leave all their things behind, and where would they go? We tried to use our GPS to see where we were, to see if we could find our way back to the village. Nothing. No signal. All of our devices showed no signal. That was really not good. We always had signal, even in remote places. These woods were doing something to the signals, cutting them off, making us properly lost. Darkness came quickly under the trees. It went from late afternoon to night in what felt like moments. The woods became black around us. We put on our head torches. Beams of light cut through the dark. The trees looked different in the torchlight, taller, like they were leaning in. We decided we should stick together and try to find our way back to the path we walked on. We walked back the way we came, or what we thought was the way. The path seemed different in the dark. Everything looked the same. Trees, more trees. Blackness beyond the torchlight. Then it happened. A noise. A scream tearing through the quiet night. It was not far away, from somewhere among the trees. A scream cut short like someone stopped it. We froze. Our hearts jumped in our chests. What was that? Some animal. It did not sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. We stood there, torches pointing into the dark, listening. Nothing, just the woods, the trees, the black night. We called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" Our voices sounded small and weak in the vast woods. No answer, just silence. We started walking again, faster now. We needed to get out of these woods. We had to get back to the village. We walked and walked. The path seemed to go on, trees either side, dark above. The air felt cold now, colder than just night cold. It felt like something else was cold too. Another scream, Closer this time. Definitely a person, a scream of terror, then silence again. It gave us chills right to our bones. Something bad was happening in these woods. Something very bad. And we were right in the middle of it. We began to run. We ran as fast as we could, our torches bouncing, showing the path ahead, the trees rushing past. We had to get away from the screams. We had to get out. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs ached. We stopped to catch our breath. We looked around, still trees, still dark. Still the path stretching ahead. Had we even moved? It felt like we were still in the same place, surrounded by the same trees, the same blackness. Then another scream, very close, too close. It sounded like it was just behind the trees next to us. A scream of pure raw fear, and then nothing, just silence again, but a different kind of silence now, a silence that pressed down on you, that felt like it was listening back. One of our group was gone. We had been running in a line. Now there were only 3 of us. We looked around. Where had he gone? One moment he was there, running with us. The next he was not, vanished, just like that. Taken. Panic started to rise in my chest. Proper panic, the sort that makes you want to scream, to run, to do anything but stay still. But we had to stay calm. We had to think what was happening. Where were our friends going? What was taking them? We huddled together, the 3 of us, torches shaking in our hands. We had to get out of here. We had to find our way back. We had to survive. We started to walk again, very slowly now, keeping close, watching all around us. Another scream. From further away this time, but we recognized it. It was our friend, the one who vanished. He was still alive, but he was screaming, screaming and screaming, his voice echoing through the trees, getting fainter and fainter as he was taken further away. His scream stopped suddenly, just like the others. Then silence. Now there were 2 of us left, just me and one other. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes, reflected in the torchlight. We both knew what was happening. We were next. It was coming for us too, whatever it was. We walked on, side by side, torches pointing, scanning the trees, the path, the darkness all around. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made us jump. The woods felt alive, but not in a good way. Alive with something evil, something that hunted in the dark. We stumbled, tripping on roots. We pushed on, desperate to find anything familiar, anything that showed we were going the right way, back towards safety. But there was nothing, just trees, path, dark, endless trees, endless path, endless dark. Then the ground changed. It was not soft earth anymore. It was hard, flat. We looked down. Concrete. We were on concrete. In the middle of the woods? What was this? We followed the concrete. It led away from the path into a darker part of the trees. The concrete opened out into a small clearing, and there it was. A door, a metal door set into the ground. Like a bunker door, in the woods. Why? What was this place? We went to the door. It had a handle, a metal handle, cold to the touch. I pulled the handle. The door opened. It opened easily, too easily. It should have been locked or stuck or something, but it just opened, revealing steps going down into the dark. Darkness below, deeper than the night outside. A smell came up from below, a bad smell. A sickly, sweet and rotten smell, the smell of death. We hesitated. Should we go down there? Was this the way out, or was this something even worse? But what choice did we have? Stay out here in the dark woods, where our friends were taken, or go down into the unknown dark? We went down, step by step, into the black. The smell got stronger as we went down. The air became colder, heavier. We reached the bottom of the steps. We were in a small room, concrete walls, a concrete floor. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, giving off a dim yellow light. And then we saw what was in the room. Piles of things, clothes, boots, rucksacks, camping gear, just like in the tents. But mixed in with them, scattered all around, were bones. Human bones, skulls, ribs, arms, legs, piled on top of each other, mixed with the belongings of the people who wore them. This was it. This was where they went. The people from the tents, and maybe others too. This bunker, this place of death. We stood there, frozen, staring at the horror all around us. The smell was overpowering now, making me want to be sick. Then a sound from behind us, from the steps we just came down. A sound coming from the dark stairwell. Footsteps. Not our footsteps, something else. Something coming down the steps after us. Something that was in the woods. Something that took our friends. Footsteps approaching. I settled into the soft couch, the glow of the television flickering in the dark room. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the silence pressed down around me. I had taken this babysitting job to earn some extra cash, but now I felt uneasy in this unfamiliar house. The parents had left clear instructions: keep the doors locked and don't let anyone inside. Simple enough. The child, a small boy with bright eyes, was already asleep. I glanced at him, tucked under a fluffy blanket. I allowed myself to relax, but something felt off. It was the kind of feeling that makes your skin prickle. Midnight crept in. The television noise faded into the background as I kept an eye on the sleeping boy. Suddenly he stirred and murmured in his sleep. I watched as he blinked awake, his gaze finding mine. His small finger pointed towards the dark hallway. "Can I let my sister in?" he asked, his voice soft and innocent. I frowned, a chill racing down my spine. "You don't have a sister," I thought. My heart quickened as I shook my head. He simply nodded, his eyes wide, still pointing. An unease settled deeper within me. I turned my attention to the camera feed displayed on the screen beside me. I gasped when I noticed the front door. It was opening and closing on its own, the shadows flitting about in the dim light. Panic coursed through me as I thought of the instructions. Keep the doors locked. I dashed towards the front door, each step heavy with dread. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated, heart pounding. I glanced back at the boy who sat watching me, still pointing at the hallway. I thought of the parents' warning. No one was to enter. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from the hallway, a noise that made my heart stop. I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The boy's eyes were fixed on the darkness, as if something were creeping ever closer. I had to check. The urge to protect him overpowered my fear. With trembling hands, I crept down the hallway. The walls closed in around me, the shadows deepening as I approached the door. I reached the threshold, my breath shallow and quick. The door swung wide, revealing only darkness. I strained my eyes, searching for anything that could explain the boy's strange request. Nothing moved. Then I heard it, a faint, rustling sound, like whispers floating through the air. It sent chills racing down my spine. The boy's soft voice drifted from behind me, still pointing toward the empty corridor. My heart thudded violently as I turned to face him, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He stared into the darkness, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. I followed his gaze again, my heart now pounding in a chaotic rhythm. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, and the air felt thick and charged, as if something terrible was waiting just beyond my view. A sudden slam jolted me from my thoughts. I whipped around to see the front door swinging shut. I rushed back, reaching for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The child's small voice broke through my panic, asking to let his sister in once more. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I needed to get out, to protect him, but I was trapped in this nightmare. I turned back to him, but he was no longer alone. The shadows seemed to swirl around him, stretching into long, claw-like forms, reaching out, beckoning. I screamed, but no sound escaped. The darkness crept closer, and the boy just smiled, pointing into the abyss. In that moment, I understood the door had never truly been locked. The house held secrets I was never meant to uncover. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go, only the chilling laughter that echoed in the dark, wrapping me in despair. The job was always the same. Lock up, walk around, make sure everything stays as it should until morning. Tonight felt different, though I couldn't say why. The school building stood empty, classrooms dark, hallways silent, all perfectly normal, except it wasn't truly silent. There was a sound, faint, carried on the night breeze, drifting through the open window in the main hall. Laughter, children's laughter, abandoned school. No children, night-time. Laughter shouldn't be there. I stood still, inside the main entrance, listening. The laughter was still there, distant but clear, like children playing outside. Impossible. No one should be here at this hour, especially not children. I moved towards the main doors, pushing them open and stepping out into the school playground. Moonlight washed over the swings, the slide, the climbing frame. Empty. Everything still. The laughter stopped. Just the wind then, I reasoned, playing tricks. Old buildings make noises, my imagination working overtime. I continued my rounds, checking doors, windows, making sure everything was secure. The laughter did not return, and I began to relax, telling myself it had been nothing. Back inside, I continued through the hallways. Each classroom door was closed, windows dark, silence pressed in, broken only by the sound of my own shoes on the linoleum floor. I checked the library, the empty canteen, the assembly hall, all as it should be, empty and locked. Then, as I walked past a longer stretch of hallway, the laughter returned. Not as faint this time, clearer, closer, definitely children laughing. It spun around the empty corridor, echoing off the walls and closed classroom doors. I stopped again, listening harder, trying to pinpoint where it came from. It seemed to be coming from outside again, from the direction of the playground, but it sounded sharper now, more distinct, not just the wind. I retraced my steps back towards the main entrance. Opening the doors again, I stepped back out into the playground. The moonlight still bathed everything in a pale glow. The slide stood motionless, the climbing frame still, but the swings were moving. Not much, just a slight sway, as if someone had just got off them, a gentle, fading motion. The laughter had stopped again. Only the quiet night remained. A breeze, maybe? But there was little wind. And the swings were barely moving, just a soft back-and-forth motion, enough to notice, enough to make something cold settle in my stomach. I walked towards the swings. There were 4 in a row, all metal-framed, seats hanging from chains. As I approached, they stilled completely, hanging perfectly straight. No breeze now, no sound, just silence and the empty playground under the moon. I reached out, touching one of the swing seats. Cold metal, perfectly ordinary. Just a swing. But the slight movement, the laughter before, it was not ordinary. I turned, looking back at the school building. Dark windows, stared back, empty classrooms inside. But something didn't feel right. The silence was too complete, the emptiness too absolute. It felt like something was missing, or perhaps something was present that shouldn't be. I went back inside, locking the main doors behind me. The corridors seemed darker now, colder. The silence seemed deeper. I quickened my pace, wanting to finish my rounds and get back to the security office, to the lights, to the radio, to something normal. In another hallway, near the older part of the school building, I noticed something on the wall. A picture, old, faded, hanging slightly askew. It was a class photograph. Children from years ago, posed in rows, with a teacher standing at the side. Dust covered the frame, the glass cloudy. I paused, wiping the dust away with my sleeve. The faces of the children emerged, smiling, small, innocent faces. They stared out from the past, frozen in time. A normal class photo from a normal school. I moved to walk on, but something made me stop. Something about the photo held my attention. I looked closer, studying the faces again, the children in the front row, then the middle row, then the back. In the back row, standing behind the other children, was a figure. Taller than the children, slightly out of focus. At first glance, just another adult, maybe another teacher who had stepped into the frame at the last moment. But something was not quite right. The face was indistinct, partly obscured. I leaned closer, peering at the face in the back row, trying to make out the features, trying to understand why something about this figure felt so unsettling. I wiped the glass again, cleaning away more dust. The face became clearer, sharper, more defined, and then I gasped, because the face in the back row, in the old class photograph, staring back at me from behind the smiling children, was my face, exactly my face, the same features, the same eyes, the same shape, but younger, much younger, a child's face, but undeniably, recognizably my own. I stared at the photo, unable to move, unable to breathe. My own face in a class photo from years ago, in a school I had never attended, in a time before I even worked here, before I even knew this place existed. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands went cold. The laughter returned, not distant now, not faint, very clear, very close. Right behind me, children's laughter echoing in the empty hallway, and the photograph on the wall, with my face staring back from the past. I stood frozen, listening to the laughter, feeling the blood drain from my face, the air growing cold around me as the sound of playing children filled the silent, abandoned school. Boxes were everywhere. They filled the hallways, climbed the stairs and blocked doorways. Moving house was always chaos. We began to unpack room by room, starting with the kitchen, the heart of any home. Days blurred into a cycle of cardboard and bubble wrap. Eventually, only the attic remained untouched. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing through a gap in the boarded window. The air up there was still and smelled of old wood and forgotten things. Pushing aside cobwebs, I started to explore. Tucked in a corner beneath a musty sheet was a television. An old one, boxy and grey, with dials and knobs instead of buttons. It looked ancient, like something from another age. Curiosity tugged. We hadn't brought a television for this room, had planned to leave it empty, a space for storage, or, well, we hadn't decided. But this old set had a strange appeal, a forgotten relic in this forgotten space. With effort, I dragged it down the narrow attic stairs, its bulk surprisingly cumbersome. Downstairs, in the living room which was slowly taking shape, I found a plug. Why not, I reasoned. Just to see if it worked. A bit of fun amidst the unpacking fatigue. I plugged it in and flicked the power switch on the side of the set. The screen crackled to life, displaying a blizzard of white noise. Static. Every channel was the same chaotic snowstorm. Disappointing, but not unexpected for something so old. Then, as I cycled through the channels again, one flickered, stabilized. It wasn't clear, far from it, grainy and washed out, but it was an image, not just static. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the blurry shapes. It looked familiar. Too familiar. My breath hitched. It was the living room. Our living room. The very room I was standing in. The arrangement of boxes, the half-unpacked curtains hanging limply, the rug still rolled in the corner. Everything matched. The angle was odd, slightly off-center, like being viewed from the corner of the room near the doorway, but there was no mistake. It was undeniably this room. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This couldn't be live, could it? Some kind of recording, maybe, left behind by the previous owners, but why would they record this? An empty room filled with boxes? It made no sense. I moved closer to the screen, my eyes scanning every detail. The image on the TV showed me, or someone dressed like me, turning away from the camera angle, heading towards the area where the window was in the real room. It was like watching a ghost of myself, a faded echo from when? From just now? Or some time before? I walked over to the window in the real room, mirroring the action of the figure on the screen. Then I turned back, looking at the TV. The figure on the screen also turned. Our actions mirrored each other with a slight, impossible delay. It felt deeply unsettling watching this distorted reflection of reality playing out on the dusty screen. For a moment I just stood there, transfixed, caught in the loop of this strange broadcast. Then a thought sparked in my mind. What if it was live? Impossible, surely, but what if... I decided to test it. I lifted my hand, waving it in front of the TV camera, if there even was one. On the screen, the grainy figure also lifted its hand, a blurry, indistinct gesture that followed mine. The delay was almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second, but enough to make my stomach clench. This was no recording, and it was something else. I felt a prickle of fear, a cold sensation spreading outwards from my chest. This was more than just odd, it was deeply disturbing. I should switch it off, I thought, just unplug it and forget about it. But a strange compulsion held me rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to the screen. Minutes ticked by, or perhaps much longer. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I stood there, mesmerized by the grainy image of my living room. Nothing changed on the screen. Just the static background hum and the slightly distorted view of the room, the figure me, now still facing towards the window on screen, just standing, just being. The sun began to dip below the horizon, the light outside fading, casting long, stretching forms across the real living room. Inside the TV screen, the room also seemed to darken, the grainy picture losing more and more clarity as the light diminished. The figure remained still. I considered turning off the lights in the real room just to see what would happen on the TV. A morbid curiosity, a desire to push this strange situation further took hold. I reached for the light switch, plunging the room into near darkness. On the TV screen, the change was instant. Darkness swallowed the grainy image, leaving only the faintest suggestion of the room's shape, a murky outline against the deeper black of the screen. The figure was almost invisible now, a shadow within shadows. I turned the lights back on, blinking in the sudden brightness. The TV image sharpened again, returning to the grainy view of the room. The figure still in the same position. It was like night and day on the screen, mirroring the lights in the real room, except the figure, it hadn't moved. Not even a flicker. The stillness of the figure on the screen was unnerving. In the real room, I shifted my feet, feeling restless, needing to do something, anything to break the spell of this strange TV. I should just switch it off. Yes, that was the sensible thing to do, but before I could reach for the switch, something happened on the screen that made my blood run cold. Behind the grainy figure, in the corner of the living room shown on TV, a shape appeared, At first it was just a smudge of deeper darkness within the already murky shadows, but then it resolved itself, took form, a figure, another figure, taller, darker, more indistinct than the first. It stood behind the grainy figure on the screen, just there, immobile, watching. Or there appeared to be watching. It was hard to tell in the grainy, washed-out image, but something about its posture, its stillness, sent a wave of icy dread through me. The grainy figure on the screen remained unaware, facing the window, oblivious to whatever was now standing behind it, but I saw it. I was seeing it, here, in my living room, watching a grainy television picture of my living room, and seeing a dark shape standing behind a figure that might be me, but wasn't. The dark shape on the screen didn't move. It just stood there, a silent, ominous presence in the corner of the grainy living room. And I stood here, in the real living room, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the television, from the dark figure that had appeared on the screen, standing behind the grainy image of me. The flat was cheap, really cheap. That should have been a sign, perhaps, but I needed somewhere quickly, and the price was impossible to ignore. It was on the top floor of an old building, slightly away from the main road. It was basic, just one room with a small kitchen area and a bathroom. Perfect for me, I thought then. The first night was odd. I couldn't sleep properly. I kept waking up. Each time I opened my eyes, I had this prickling feeling, like eyes were on me, even in the dark. I would sit up, heart racing a bit, looking around the room. Nothing. Just my things, unpacked and scattered around, trying to make this new space feel like home. The feeling would fade after a bit and I'd lie back down, only for it to return again when I next woke. It happened every night after that. Sleep became broken, snatched moments between periods of wakefulness and that awful feeling. I started leaving a small lamp on at night, thinking light might help. It didn't. The feeling was still there, just as strong, perhaps stronger now because I could actually see the room, see there was nothing there, and yet still feel like something was. One night I woke up as usual. The lamp was on. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling. It was plain, white, a bit uneven, typical of old buildings. My eyes roamed across it without really looking. Then something caught my attention near the corner of the room where the walls met the ceiling. Faint lines. Scratches, maybe? I sat up properly in bed and squinted. Yes, they were scratches. Thin, pale lines in the paint, radiating out from the very corner where the ceiling and two walls joined. They were faint, easy to miss if you weren't looking directly. I got out of bed and stood on a chair to get a better look. Definitely scratches. Like something had been dragged across the ceiling over and over. They didn't look new, more like old damage that had been painted over. But why were they there? On the ceiling in the corner. It made no sense. The next day I decided to ask the landlord. He was an older man, quite quiet, lived in the flat below. I went downstairs and knocked on his door. He opened it, looked a bit surprised to see me. I asked him if he had a moment. He nodded and let me in. His flat was much the same as mine, but felt different. Darker, somehow, full of old furniture and the scent of something musty. I explained about the scratches on the ceiling in my bedroom. I asked if he knew anything about them, what might have caused them. He listened, his face remaining quite still, showing very little reaction. When I finished speaking, he looked away for a moment towards a window in his living room. Then he turned back to me. He hesitated. I could see it in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Finally he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. He said the last person who lived in my flat had problems. He paused again, seeming unsure how much to say. I pressed him gently, explaining I was just curious about the scratches and wanted to know if there was any history to the flat I should be aware of. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. He said the tenant before me hadn't stayed very long. He'd moved in, seemed fine at first, then started complaining. Complaining about what? I asked. The landlord shifted his feet a little. He said the man claimed there was something in the flat with him. Something that stalked him in his bedroom at night. I felt a chill ripple down my spine despite myself. Stalked him? I repeated. The landlord nodded slowly. He said the man had become increasingly agitated, convinced he was being watched, even in his sleep. He said the man described a presence, something unseen but always there, always near. I asked him if he believed it. He shrugged, an odd, dismissive gesture that didn't quite fit with the serious look on his face. He said he'd put it down to stress, perhaps. The man had seemed anxious generally, he said, but then he trailed off again. Then what? I prompted, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed again. He told me one morning he'd gone to check on the tenant because he hadn't seen him for a couple of days. He'd found the flat door unlocked. He went inside. He found the man in the bedroom, dead. Just like that, he said it. Dead! My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, speechless. He continued, his voice even quieter now. He said it was awful. The room was disturbed. Things thrown around, the bedclothes ripped. And the man... He faltered again. He found the man on the floor next to the bed, his fingernails pulled out, all of them, ripped clean off, blood everywhere, and... He swallowed hard, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest moment before flickering away again. And around the bed, scratch marks, deep ones, not on the ceiling, he clarified quickly, on the floor and the walls around the bed. But deep, raw scratch marks, as if something had been clawing at the room itself. The police, of course, had investigated, but they hadn't found anything conclusive. No forced entry, no sign of another person. They ruled it as an accident or something like that. He didn't go into specifics. He just said they closed the case, put it down to something unexplained and tragic. He'd had the flat cleaned, repainted, tried to forget about it, he said. And he hadn't mentioned any of this to me when I'd moved in. He hadn't wanted to scare me off. He needed the rent, he admitted, almost apologetically. He'd thought it was all over, done with, until I mentioned the scratches on the ceiling. The scratches on the ceiling. I'd almost forgotten about them in the shock of what he'd just told me. But now they came back into sharp focus. I asked him about them. Had the police mentioned scratches on the ceiling? He shook his head. No, just around the bed, he repeated. The ceiling scratches must have been there before, he guessed. Old damage. He hadn't noticed them himself when he'd repainted. I thanked him for telling me, though gratitude was the last thing I was feeling. I left his flat and went back upstairs to mine. My flat. The flat where a man had died, terrified, claiming he was being stalked by something unseen. The flat where he'd been found with his fingernails ripped out and deep scratch marks around his bed. I went back into my bedroom. The room felt different now, colder. I looked up at the ceiling corner again. The faint scratches were still there, just as before. Pale lines in the paint, radiating out from the corner. Scratch marks that hadn't been there when the previous tenant died. Scratch marks that the landlord hadn't noticed when he repainted. Scratch marks that had appeared since I moved in, since I started waking up every night with the feeling of being watched. I stood there, staring at the ceiling, at those faint, pale lines. The room felt completely still, silent, except for the faint, almost imperceptible sound from above, somewhere between the ceiling and the roof, a dry, rasping sound, like scraping. It was very faint, barely audible. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. A soft scrape directly above me from the corner of the ceiling where the scratches were. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I backed away from the corner, slowly, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The scraping continued, a soft, regular sound, almost like nails, dragging lightly across the surface above. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I kept backing away, moving towards the door of the bedroom. The scraping went on, steady, constant, scrape, scrape, scrape. I reached the door and moved out of the bedroom, into the main room. I stopped there, listening. The scraping was fainter now, muffled by the ceiling and the walls, but it was still there. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to think, just listening to the faint rhythmic scraping from above. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Coming from the corner of my bedroom ceiling, coming from somewhere just above me, and I knew with a cold, absolute certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was not going to stop. The key turned and the door swung inward. Home. Shoes sat neatly by the door, just as I always left them. Post lay on the small table, unopened. The television in the living room reflected the afternoon light. Paused on a news program from the morning. Everything looked right. Everything was exactly as it should be. I walked into the kitchen, the kettle on the stove, the mugs on the draining board, the fruit bowl on the counter, all in their usual places. A small brown leaf from the plant by the window rested on the work surface. I noticed it, then brushed it away. Something was not right. It was a feeling deep within me, a sudden jolt, a prickle at the back of my neck. My skin tightened. I stopped moving, standing in the middle of the kitchen floor. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place, any sign. Nothing. Everything remained normal, ordinary, but the feeling grew, intensified. It was a cold dread seeping into my bones. Panic started to bubble up unbidden. I needed to leave, needed to get out of the house. Now. I turned, intending to retrace my steps, to go back through the living room, out the front door, away from whatever nameless thing had triggered this sudden terror. Then I froze again. A noise from upstairs. Footsteps, not loud but distinct. Footsteps above me. Impossible. I live alone. There should be no one upstairs. No one in the house but me. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drumbeat. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but I remained rooted to the spot, listening, straining to hear over the frantic pounding of my own pulse. The footsteps again. Upstairs, moving, pacing. From the kitchen, the stairs were just outside the door in the hallway. Dark wood, carpeted in a faded red, usually familiar, comforting the way to bed, to the spare room, to the attic hatch. Now they seemed alien, menacing, leading to what? I listened harder. The footsteps continued. Regular, measured, as if someone was walking back and forth across the landing above. Back and forth, back and forth. Who? How? My mind raced, desperately searching for any explanation, any logical reason. A neighbor? Impossible. The houses were detached. Soundproofing between them was good. And besides, these sounds were inside my house, directly above me. An animal? A bird trapped inside. Too heavy, too regular, too much like footsteps. A burglar. But why upstairs? Why not ransacking downstairs? And why just walking? Why not any sounds of forced entry, of breaking, of searching? My blood ran cold. This wasn't a burglar. This was something else, something unknown, something that defied reason. Something that instilled a primal fear deep within my core. The pacing continued overhead, back and forth, back and forth. I wanted to move, to run, to escape. My legs felt like lead, refusing to obey the frantic commands of my brain. Terror held me captive, glued to the spot, listening to the impossible sounds from above. I tried to think. What should I do? Call the police? But what would I say? Hello, police. There are footsteps upstairs, but I live alone. They would think I was mad. They would dismiss it. Or worse, they would come, find nothing, and then I would be left alone in the house with whatever it was. Go upstairs? Absolutely not. Every instinct screamed against it. That was where the sound was coming from. That was where the thing was. Going upstairs was walking into the unknown, facing whatever was making those footsteps. Stay downstairs and listen to it pacing above me. Trapped in my own home, imprisoned by invisible feet above. That felt unbearable too. The footsteps changed. They stopped pacing. Silence from upstairs. A different, more acute kind of fear gripped me now. The pacing was unnerving, but this silence was worse. What was it doing now? Where was it? I held my breath, listening with every fiber of my being. Complete silence except for the frantic hammering of my own heart. The silence stretched out, became oppressive, suffocating. Each second felt like an eternity. Then a new sound, not footsteps this time, a scraping from directly above me. In the ceiling, a dry, dragging, scraping sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floorboards. Directly above the kitchen, slowly, deliberately scraping, dragging across the ceiling. My eyes fixed on the ceiling. White plaster, ordinary, familiar, but now it seemed to pulse with some unseen menace. The scraping continued, inching its way across the ceiling. I wanted to scream, to shout, to make any noise, to break the terrifying silence and the awful scraping sound. But my throat was constricted, dry, unable to make a sound. Fear had stolen my voice. The scraping stopped again. Silence, more silence, deeper silence. Then a creak. Upstairs, a floorboard creaking. As if something had just shifted its position. Moved just slightly. Creak. Silence. And then another creak. Closer now, it seemed. Or maybe it was my imagination, my heightened senses playing tricks. But it sounded like the creaking was getting closer. Creak, 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 creak. The sequence of creaks moving across the upstairs floor, coming closer and closer to the top of the stairs. The stairs leading down to where I was standing, frozen in terror in my kitchen. The creaking stopped. Once more, silence, complete, absolute silence. I stared towards the hallway, towards the stairs, toward the unseen top of the stairs, waiting, dreading, knowing somehow that something was about to happen, something terrible. The silence stretched, became unbearable. The air in the kitchen felt cold, still. The ordinary, familiar room had become a prison, a trap. And I was alone, trapped inside with it. Then a sound. Not a creak this time, not footsteps, something different, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, a sort of rustling from the top of the stairs, a rustling sound like fabric or paper or dry leaves, a soft, whispering rustle. It grew slightly, became more distinct. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Coming from the top of the stairs, moving down the stairs, slowly, cautiously, rustle, rustle, rustle. Down the stairs. Each rustle a step. A soundless step, save for the dry, whispering rustle. Down the stairs, closer, closer. I could see the top of the stairs now from the kitchen doorway. The first few steps visible, leading down into the hallway, still empty, nothing there. Just the faded red carpet on the wooden treads, but the rustling sound was closer now, much closer, almost at the top of the stairs. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Just at the top of the stairs now, just about to appear, to become visible, to come into view. I held my breath, every muscle screaming in tension, eyes fixed on the top of the stairs, waiting to see... What? The rustling stopped. Silence again, but a different silence now, a silence pregnant with expectation, with dread, with the certainty that something was there, just out of sight, just about to... And then the faintest of sounds again, barely audible, so soft it could almost be imagined. A whisper, not a spoken word, not language, something else, something inhuman. A whisper of sound, so faint it was like the brush of air against my ear. A whisper from just beyond the top of the stairs, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a whisper that seemed to seep into my very bones, carrying with it a cold, nameless terror. The whisper continued, unchanging, constant, a low, sibilant sound that resonated deep within my soul. I stood frozen, listening to the whisper from the top of the stairs, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even think, consumed entirely by a fear so profound, so absolute, that it erased everything else. The whisper continued and continued and continued.